Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are reviewing a film that came strongly recommended by our man Truman here. And I knew that you were a cinephile, man, but this was a surprise. The movie that he recommended was Jacques Tati's Playtime, 1967 French film, billed as a comedy, was considered a masterpiece of all comedies and intensely amusing by some French reviewers. So this was I don't have a whole lot of exposure to Tati, or was it Tati or Tati before you brought him up, and so I wasn't sure what we were getting into. And I really have to say that if there's been a film that I've watched that is truly amusing, like in terms of the true definition of amusement, it is this film. This was a real, like, pleasure. It was a real, like, sort of comforting, fun. It's not a laugh out loud guffaw type of movie, but it was just, you know what it was? Pleasant. This was just a pleasant film. We watched some pretty intense stuff, you and I, and this is a nice sort of reprieve from all the intense film that we watch. So yeah, I thank you for bringing this one, insisting on this one. This was good.
Yeah, and I have loved this movie for a while now. I first saw it a few years ago, when it, in kind of a similar situation, it was like very strongly recommended to me. And I think over time, this movie I see is one that often gets a lot of buzz, and it's clear why. It's on like the AFI's top 100 films of all time lists, and all those types of lists. But I think you kind of hone in on sort of what the appeal of this film is that it's just a pleasant, very enjoyable, and kind of like relaxing watch. And it, in many respects, it subverts what we think of as like traditional filmmaking, the traditional ways of filmmaking, and particularly the traditional ways of Hollywood narrative filmmaking. We think about filmmaking, and storytelling within sort of like the Hollywood system as this kind of very regimented and fairly formulaic thing. We think in terms of conflict and 3-act structure and all of these things, but Playtime has almost none of that. Playtime barely has like the main character, who's played by Jacques Tati, Monsieur Hulot. He is barely, he is not a protagonist in the traditional sense, and the story of Playtime is not one that
I didn't mean to interrupt, man. We've lost your video.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, sorry, man. There we go.
There we go.
No, you're right. Yeah. It isn't traditional Hollywood narrative. And Tati, who does play a character in the film, is not playing, what we would understand as a formulaic protagonist. And that's part of the charm of it, that we're just sort of part of a movie watching these people arrive at an airport, which the airport, I'm looking at it and I'm like, this doesn't look like France. This looks like 1960s Los Angeles. It's very sort of stark white buildings and freeways and streets. It doesn't look anything like the France that we know. And, but it gives that very mid-century feel, which is really kind of fun. And you see these people arriving. The group of tourists in the film are Americans, but you have other people there as well, visiting what I assume is Paris. And you're just sort of along for the ride. It's like you're just another person in the crowd at moments. And then there's other times where you're following Tati, who I believe is playing a character named Hulot, who is just making his way through I guess, a department store that's exhibiting different new products, like different vacuums and different home products and chairs and things. And sometimes you're with him, and sometimes you're with a group of
Yeah.
tourists, and you're just kind of along for the ride. And it's, again, not a traditional narrative, but I got sucked in. I really wasn't thinking I was going to enjoy this as much as I did, and I just went along for the ride, and it was just fun.
Yeah, it kind of has that effect of like a Where's Waldo book, you know,
Hmm.
where it's just so packed with detail and it's very rich, and there's so much to take in as you're looking at it. You know, it's like the Where's Waldo. You can kind of stare at it for hours, looking for where Hulo is in the background of these enormous sets. And again, I think that's part of what makes this film so unique is like the appeal of it is not following a narrative or having a character following a character's journey or watching them evolve or kind of taking away something that these things which we traditionally think of in in filmmaking. The like if when you ask me like, oh, what is this movie about, like what happens in it, I was like, oh, it's kind of tough to explain. And even
Right.
now, having seen it probably like 5 times at this point, I still find it kind of tough to actually explain what the um what the movie is about. I would say like, oh, when you asked me, I said, oh, it's about like this character kind of in this sort of modern world that feels very alienating and foreign. But that he Hulot kind of serves to disrupt sort of the modern and kind of isolated status quo that people living in the city have. And he comes in with this kind of like traditional values, and he approaches things with this sort of kind of like innocent, almost childlike
Hmm.
curiosity to him. And in that way, he kind of exposes sort of like the ridiculousness of these social conventions. And a lot of the social conventions that we see in Playtime are deliberately, they it's not realistic in the sense that, Hulot isn't walking around actual Paris.
Right.
It's this kind of this very abstract representation of what this city is.
Hmm.
And because of that, I think, as with any film, it gives us this kind of very big um, depiction of the world and sort of Tati's understanding of it, where people are all in these kind of glass and metal boxes, and just confused, surrounded by confusing technology that doesn't make their lives any easier, and the world feels very sterile and clean. Um, and it's one of
I
those
didn't.
things
I
which,
didn't. I didn't get
and
anything. Sorry to interrupt. I didn't get. I really did not get anything too strongly ideological from this movie. It just personally. What when I saw it again billed as a comedy, it's a light comedy in that it fulfills its own title. It's called Playtime, and like you said, Hulot is almost sort of childlike when he's going through the airport and the offices, the trade exhibition. He's very much at the apartments. He's very much um, almost discovering these places for the first time. So I didn't necessarily see a critique of modern life per se. I mean, there was a few moments like at the restaurant where they couldn't get the air conditioning to work, which, I mean, I guess you could say that. But this movie felt very slice of life, but sort of fantastical slice of life in that it's Paris, but it's not. It's emphasizing modernity, but you can't quite place the city necessarily. Like to me, it had the feel of Los Angeles or big cities in '60s movies, like Hitchcock films and so on. It could be anywhere in a way, and that didn't necessarily bother me because it was all that's all so much a setup for uh, the different the different chapters. The airport, the offices, the trade exhibition, the restaurant, all of that. and it's just it seems very it's slice of life, but slice of like almost like like slice of dream maybe. Like there's an aspect of it that seems very dreamlike. I can see myself having had dreams like this, where I think I'm in a city, but I couldn't tell you which city it was. I'm arriving in an airport. I'm at a trade show. All of these things, and that's kind of where I don't know that this would necessarily grab a mainstream moviegoer necessarily, but that's kind of I think the appeal of it, that it truly is unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It's reminiscent to me of Tarkovsky's films, because Tarkovsky's films have sort of a hypnotic, otherworldly, sometimes dreamlike feel to them. All of them do, in fact. Even when you're rooted in reality, but it's reality heightened, and that's what this movie I think does really well. At the same time, you kind of fall in love with Hulot, this befuddled Frenchman who's just sort of stumbling through the city, and it's just fun. It's pleasant, which doesn't sound like a good time. There's no crazy twists and turns. There's no big reveals. There's no, there's nothing like that in this movie. But I think that's why it's so fun. It reminded me that film doesn't have to be anything too crazy. Film can just be fun. Film can just be pleasant and heartwarming. That's what this film is. It's very heartwarming in a lot of ways. You're watching these different people going out and just having a good time, a night on the town. And that was kind of fun to see. That I think we overemphasize conflict sometimes obviously in any story you need a conflict to make it interesting, but it feels like that overemphasis on conflict is bleeding over to every aspect of art, and we've sort of forgotten that art can just be fun and light and pleasant.
Yeah, and playtime, I think it really emphasizes it. Well, rather, it demonstrates the ways that like little c conflict work.
Mm-hmm.
In film, there isn't like some grand, big narrative arc conflict where saving the world kind of thing in
Right.
playtime, but it illustrates like on a very small, very granular level, the performance that Tati does is full of interacting with kind of small little conflicts, where he has to like follow someone with a folder, and
Right.
the person walks one way and he walks the other, and they're coming in and out of different doors. And again, to describe it, it sounds kind of boring,
Right.
where it's like, people are walking around these buildings and they don't really talk. But again, the Tati's performance, the pantomime, that the expertise of pantomime that he shows is one of many things that really carries the film. And it's surprising, like you said, it's not like there's a ton of like big laugh out loud moments, although there
Right.
are a few that I really like. But it is this kind of, yeah, like you said, it's this kind of mesmerizing. It's one of those films that you experience, and it's kind of mesmerizing in that way. And Tati's performance is a big part of that. The cinematography and set design, I think, is probably the star of it, more so than anything. It's incredible. Like,
it is
the most incredible. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. The in the beginning, it seems very sterile because they're at the airport. And one of the things I noticed as we go from set to set, from airport to offices, from offices to trade exhibition, then to the apartments, and then the Royal Garden, which is that restaurant. The set design gets richer and gets more interesting, and so it slowly pulls you in. It's like when you read a good book and you have a general idea of what it's about, but there's nothing on the canvas as you're starting. And then the more you read through, it keeps filling in and filling in with texture and color and character. And that's exactly what this movie does. And it does it without you really noticing. It's I kind of feel like this movie, you're right. It doesn't sound like anything too interesting, and yet it is. Just the fact that it's such a departure from most everything that's being made today. That should be enough for people to watch it, I think. Just and if you have to pop an edible to get into it, go right ahead. But I don't I don't think you have to do that. But it is just kind of a fun little trip.
Yeah. And yeah, again, I think it's a fairly easy sell as well, because I don't think yeah, like everyone that I've shown this movie to has really loved it. Um, and I think that's kind of like an encouraging thing, in the sense that, people do respond to this type of film, like just I remember watching it for the first time, where I didn't know what to expect, but just being able to, like you said, take it in and experience and enjoy the film. And even, for me, trying to turn off the desire to sort of analyze it,
Mhm.
and understand it, and just simply appreciate it for what it is, for Tati's performance, for the aesthetics. A lot of the times it feels like an Edward Hopper painting, one of my favorite painters,
Sure.
where it has this very minimal look, that's very special. I think there isn't really any other movie that looks or feels like this. One of the things that
Right.
made me bring up Playtime initially is when we watched World on a Wire. Um, and I made the observation that a lot of the color palette is very similar, where World on a Wire has this very steely look, and Playtime also makes use of a lot of grays and a lot of metal and glass in the sets. It's much more minimalist than a World on a Wire,
Mhm.
which is very, very lavish, let's say, with a lot of it that design, and that's great too. But yeah, Playtime in particular, like it's such a joy just to look at. I've
Mhm.
got some photos pulled up on my computer here too, and like even just looking at them, I'm like, man, yeah, I want to watch this. And I don't
Yeah, the composition was
know.
so well done, and the cinematography is so well done. And then you look at the set design and costumes. It's like how could they not have knocked it out of the park with it? Because it's really just beautifully constructed all the way around.
Yeah, and the yeah, and part of, I think, what takes this film, even on its own, I think it would be a, a really great film. But what I love so much about it, and all of Tati's films, which are all essentially this, I kind of
Okay.
I have like the Criterion box set of Tati's movies. Um, and, like all of Tati's films are kind of about this. I sort of view it as just this like serialized one very long movie, where he's always playing Hulot, kind of always doing what he does in this film, where he goes into this sort of very modern and very kind of isolating world, and then he upends it. But in particular, with Playtime, I think Playtime does have a fair amount to say about the effects, about what living in a like modern city is like, and the ways that it kind of separates people from one another. This very you noted earlier how, like, you when you saw the airport initially, you said, oh, like, this doesn't really look like Paris. This looks like LA or any city around this era, because of the aesthetics and designs. And that's a very deliberate thing. We see
Right.
later on in the film, there's like these posters in a travel agency,
Mhm.
and there's all these different cities, and it's like, oh, visit Rio de Janeiro, and visit, Munich, and visit Los Angeles, and every single one of them has just like this same
Yes.
big concrete building, like the ones that they're in and seeing, and it's remarkable to see this even in like the late 60s, early 70s as well. But sort of many of the themes that people deal with today, sort in like grappling with modernity, the
Mhm.
homogenous effects of globalization, the way all these cities look the same and feel the same, and they're hyper modern, but no one there isn't really any real culture, you know. People don't really have any connections. I think at its core, like that's what playtime and that's what a lot of Tati's work is about. But it's optimistic. I think, you know, sometimes people can look at these things. You look at a film like Taxi Driver, you know, that's about
Right.
how living in New York City and having this modern existence is very isolating, and it drives people crazy, and it drives them to violence and to sort of go insane. And I love Taxi Driver too, but Playtime again, it's
We'll
more.
have to cover Taxi Driver for sure. But
Oh, absolutely.
I like yeah, that would you're talking about the different, you know, the travel agency with all of the posters with that one same stark building. Yes,
Yes.
that was not lost on me, and so I do see that certainly that critique. It's sort of, you know, and as someone, I'm from a city where architecture is, you know, our one of our religions. You know, it's you know, in Chicago, it's so important to us, and you can't just build anything. You know, if you knock down a building in a neighborhood and all of those buildings are, you know, red brick three flats, you're not going to build a Mediterranean home. It has to match, you know, there's a certain aesthetic to Chicago that we work really hard to maintain. And so that was one that really did grab my a critique that grabbed me, that you have to be careful that while modernity and innovation are really important,
Mhm.
you different places, different cities, different cultures have every right to interpret those innovations and advances in their own way. It just, you know, just because, you know, the Germans and the Japanese do a certain thing really well doesn't mean that the French and the Venezuelans have to do it the same way. So it is sort of that little warning of uh, be careful to not lose your individuality. Be careful not to lose that which makes your culture unique. So no,
Mhm.
I definitely picked up on that immediately when I saw it. I'm like, oh yeah, you know, because it's one of the things that probably makes me, and not to get too deep in the weeds here, but
Mhm.
that critique, I coming from Chicago to Los Angeles and hopping back and forth, it has bummed me out the amount of historical buildings that don't really exist anymore within the city limits of LA, because so much has been knocked down and frankly not necessarily replaced with better buildings. You know, replaced with these sort of very federal Soviet stone buildings. You know, these beautiful theaters that existed at the turn of the last century that are just gone. Going into neighborhoods and seeing like something that's hyper modern next to Mediterranean monstrosity to next to a McMansion. And again, not all LA neighborhoods are like that, but uh, I find that it's the further east and southeast you go, these neighborhoods that don't have a whole lot of capital are actually the ones that are preserving these old Art Deco and Craftsman and mid-century buildings. Whereas the further west you go and the more capital that you have, the more almost uniform the neighborhoods become. So that's just something that and so yeah, Tati's critique there is not lost on me at all, and so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things. Yeah, it again, I think part of the appeal of the movie is that it's an older movie. You know, it's from the late '60s, and even then, and this is I think one of the great like kind of meta joys of watching these older movies and seeing these things is that you can understand that people even long ago, you know, felt very similar to how you feel now. You know,
Sure.
watching oftentimes, you know, living in a city, it's very easy to feel um, isolated and alone. And again, like alienated by modern technology. In some respects, some of Tati's, I guess, criticisms of the modern world and modern technology seem very quaint now because it's like,
Right.
you know, people are confused by like panels and
Right.
buttons on walls, and it's like, oof, man,
Yeah, you have no
you
idea what's coming
you
with
don't know how
social
bad it's
media
gonna
and
get.
AI. Boy, you think you're having a hard time with figuring out the dials on this super advanced air conditioner. You have no idea what's coming. Right.
Yeah, but again, I think it's very heartening in the sense that you can watch this and you can say like, oh, this French guy who even 60 years ago, someone from another country and another time felt the same way that I do now. And film has that power of being able to tap into these universal experiences and understanding how other people feel. And that's part of the magic of playtime as well. Again, because it is not a film that focuses on conflict.
No,
It's not a film that focuses on really anything at all, other than just sort of kind of being in the moment and appreciating sort of like the world around you and the interactions that people have. And ultimately, again, it's a very optimistic film in the sense that although Tati's character Fulot, he is confused by the world and he doesn't really change the world itself. He's able to still to connect with many different people in kind of very small but meaningful ways. And I
right.
think that's a great takeaway to have, where it's like, although modern life feels very alienating, and although, modern technology, it's easy to feel very isolated and separate from other people, it is still possible and worthwhile to form, meaningful connections with people,
No,
even if it's
exactly right.
like
Exactly
the
right. And it sort of reinforces the truth that it doesn't really matter how technologically advanced a society becomes. There is still going to be that need for human beings to connect with each other, even if it's just on a very small level of chit chat or saying hello to someone, you're sharing coffee at a cafe or whatever it might be. No amount of technological advancement is going to replace the human need for connection. And yeah, that's a good thing. That's absolutely a good thing.
Mhm. Um, yeah, and so we should definitely watch some of Tati's other films too, because like this, it's a lot of very similar stuff. There's Traffic and My Uncle and a few more, and they're all really wonderful. They're all very similar experiences. None of them are quite as grand as Playtime, because again, like watching it, especially now, and I remember there was um there was a moment where you saw like one of the big wide shots that they had, and you were like, oh, that's gotta like most of that's gotta be a Matt. And then we watched some BTS, like a BTS documentary afterwards, and we saw like them fully constructing all of these enormous buildings and roads that everything takes place on. And so in that respect, it's a big triumph of like practical set design as well. And that's again also part of what makes it feel so special. There is something about seeing these enormous real buildings shot on film that gives it this quality to it that again you do not see in other films, definitely not films now, and even in films of the era. That's what
Mhm.
makes it such a so unique and stand out so much, and why this film is so well loved, because you simply, although there are things which are similar
Mhm.
in the medium of there's really nothing like this movie, and
Well, it's funny that you
it's
mentioned
just
that because I was trying to think, because we try to think of what would make great double bills with or double features for movies. And I'm watching, we got to the end of Playtime, and I was still so it felt like I'd
Mhm.
gone on a trip, and I was trying to think. It was
Yeah,
like, what would we pair with this? And I really I've only been able to come up with I mean, you could pair it with other French films, and I've pulled up stuff that I think that are worth mentioning, that are definitely worth seeing, that hopefully will review going forward. But in terms of the match of aesthetics, the match of the lightness, the match of the, I can't believe I'm using this word, the whimsical feel of Playtime, I can only come up with the classic French short film, The Red Balloon, which I
yeah.
saw as a wee lad, probably, I think in kindergarten. I think I saw it in kindergarten on reel to reel in Catholic school, which feels like a million years ago. And that film, and maybe it's because I saw it as a child, just really hit me. Um, but again, that's another light film. You're really following the journey of this red balloon, and the people and places the red balloon goes. It's very light. It's not a crazy narrative. It's just pleasant and fun. And in terms of like pairing a film with Playtime, that feels like the one that really fits. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great comp. Yeah, for everything that you just said, it really it has that same level of whimsy, and this is it's one of those movies like you don't in your day to day life you don't use the word whimsy very
Right,
often,
right,
but or I think after we watched it, not to out you, but you said it was delightful, but it really is, like
right.
it brings that out of you, that kind of like childlike, just
Hmm.
pure enjoyment, where it's like it's I always say like it's just a really joyful movie, and because of that, like it feels weird to describe it in such like glowing terms and
Right.
uncynical terms, but
Right, and that's why I feel I feel like I really hope that people watch Playtime, and you please watch the Red Balloon, and that's kind of the overall trend in film, in television, just in our culture in general right now. There's nothing wrong with a healthy skepticism, but there is a cynicism, there is sort of a nihilism that I really do not like. Not the need for every aspect of our culture to be politicized and to be turned into some type of activism, I think is really ruining life. I think it's really ruining a lot of young people. It's stealing people's ability to enjoy their lives. I'm not saying that activism, that there's no place for it, but I don't think that as much of human life needs to be as politicized as it is right now. And I think more films, more of that feel, more of the ethos of Playtime, of the Red Balloon, are really needed. Because again, to your point, I can't remember the last time I used the word delightful, whimsical, and light, to describe entertainment, because it doesn't really exist right now, and I think it's sorely needed. I would love to see somebody, any of our great A-list directors or anyone out there with the means to try making some films that are just a effing delight. That would be, I would love to see that. And we do see people taking risks
Mhm.
out there. I think Tarantino really took a risk in so many. I mean, he took a risk, but he didn't with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He could have made any movie he wanted to, and he chose to make a movie that was a love letter to Hollywood, a love letter to LA, and really a love letter to his own childhood. Who does that? Like, people don't do that anymore. And so I'd love to see more of an exploration of this sort of fantasy comedy, fantastical light um, genre. I
Mhm.
just think it's sorely needed. I think it's a nice salve on an era that is all too politicized and way too serious all the effing
Mhm.
time. It's a nice change. But there's in terms of, in addition to the Red Balloon, which in my view it's Red Balloon is a perfect pairing with Playtime. There are a couple other French films that kind of run the gamut of genre, but one of the other
Mhm.
movies that really popped up for me as we were watching Playtime is a classic 1950 French film. Um, and why am I blanking on the director? I love this film so much. Jacques Tati, that's why I kept saying Tati. Jean Cocteau,
Mhm.
who did films in the 50s. This one in particular, Orpheus, based on the old Greek myth. Orpheus 1950 is, again, it has a bit more of a narrative to it. There's definitely more conflict and drama to it because it's based on a Greek myth. But it is, I don't know, are you familiar with this film, Orpheus?
No, not
You are?
Morpheus.
Orpheus.
Morpheus? So,
Orphes. Do you know it?
no,
Okay,
I'm not familiar.
okay,
I could probably
you'll
guess
love
based
this.
off of the.
You'll love this movie. It is, it's very much. I talk about a film that's set in Paris proper, and not just any Paris, but the Paris of the late '40s, early '50s. It's absolutely gorgeous in black and white, and it's about the Orpheus myth, where we follow the character of Orpheus through um, from different. He goes through different worlds, and he's in pursuit of love, and he's on a quest. Again,
Yeah.
it's very much the Greek myth, just sent in 1950s Paris. One of the most fun parts of this movie are the super creative special effects. Again, it's 1950, so they have to do nothing but practical effects. Reversing film, shooting through mirrors, and so forth. And it's one of the most fun movies I've ever watched. It's one of my favorites of all time. And I think you'd love Orpheus. I think you'd love Cocteau. We'll watch this at some point, but it would be a great
Yeah,
companion piece to something like Playtime. Again, it's about 20 years before it, but that sort of lighter, fantastical approach is fun. Other honorable mentions that I would throw in here. Let me see here. Not really in the same genre, but films that if you like French film, if you like '60s, '50s stuff, Elevator to the Gallows, 1958, Louis Malle is an incredible film. It has the great Jean Moreau. It is the first post-war European film to have an all jazz soundtrack. It's all jazz, and it's very noir. It's set in and around Paris. It's a thriller, and the entire soundtrack is just jazz. Beautiful, beautiful film, worth watching. And again, the furthest probably from Playtime, but again, very French, very stylish, is Les Samurai, 1967, came out the same year as Playtime, with the absolutely handsome and enigmatic Alain Delon, and just an incredible. It's Melville. It's a Jean-Pierre Melville film. Just beautiful. Maybe the most beautiful samurai, not samurai, most beautiful gangster film ever made. So that's really the emphasis I feel. The connection of if there is a connection between Playtime and Les Samurai, it is just the pure dedication to aesthetic beauty. Again, tonally, narratively, genre, they're completely different films. But in terms of just pure beauty for the eye, I'd throw Les Samurai in there. Just maybe even just as the other side of the Playtime coin. Are you know Les Samurai?
Yes, I do, and I think that's actually a good comp. Aesthetically speaking, like there's a lot of similarities between Les Samurai and Playtime. Obviously, everything else about it is pretty different.
Right.
But I like what you're. I actually like that as a comp a lot because of the aesthetic similarities and also the thematic similarities too. Les Samurai, also in a similar vein to Taxi Driver, is about this very the alienating experience of living in this big modern city. And although obviously it's closer to Taxi Driver, where it has this kind of negative interpretation of what that does to people. The Samurai is much more about kind of leaning into that loneliness. There's the quote at the very beginning of it that the samurai is lonely and Alain Delon is lonely, and he doesn't really, feel much better over the course of the film. But
Right.
yeah, in terms of like the similar era, very similar aesthetics, and similar themes, Les Samurai is a good comp. It's tough for me to really think of many other things
It
that are
is tough.
similar. Les Samurai is, despite those similarities, is a very different film from Playtime. I
Mhm.
think it was, like you pointed out, there's not a lot of adult entertainment that taps into the emotions that Playtime evokes. The this like sense of delight and enjoyment and whimsy and not having to stilted conflict and hackneyed storylines. and just the willingness to sort of sit with things. You don't really see that in adult entertainment. You see it a lot, maybe like a lot of Pixar films kind of have this as well, where that feeling of whimsy, and it's primarily in children's entertainment. And I think that's kind of a shame in the sense that, again, I watch Playtime and it's such a joy, and people always respond to it so well. And it's like, well, why shouldn't more films for adults be like this? Why do we have to relegate it to stuff that's just for children? And that's not it. Obviously, there's a lot of great value to many things that are called children's entertainment, but it's kind of a common, where particularly if you're a fan of animation, people will think, oh well, animation is a children's medium. And I think in a similar way, people, I think, based off of and this is, I'm coming up with this on the spot, but like based off of the sort of like landscape of films that are regarded as being for adults, you don't get these emotions very often. And I think that kind of, in a sense, sort of reveals that people view these types of emotions as being inherently childish too, and
Right.
like it's not appropriate for adults to feel this way. It's like you said, it's not appropriate for a grown ass man to feel delighted.
Right. Right.
And I think Playtime helps a viewer tap into that, and I think that's a big part of why it's, to me, such a special movie.
No, you're absolutely right, and it is a shame that we relegate lightness and whimsy and delight to something that's inherently childish, because we're a bunch of grown men and we were blown away by this film when we watched it, you, me, and Garrett, and it made me just feel better. It really did. There used to be it's something that's been lost in terms of how we categorize entertainment. We have what's called children's fare. We have like young adult. We have adult. There used to be a category that I don't think I've heard it mentioned since the early 90s. There used to be a category called all ages. All ages entertainment. All ages entertainment were movies like The Never-Ending Story, Ridley Scott's Legend. You had movies like Daryl, if anybody remembers Daryl from the 80s. A lot of the I would say Disney animated films, or just or even Disney live action films before 1990 those were all ages films. Those were films that weren't obviously had an appeal to children, but there were also films that adults could go to, and adults could catch certain humor. And we don't use that term anymore, and it's too bad, because now we seem to be sort of splitting that if anything is even remotely fun or light, that it's inherently childish. And there's something that in our ever more overly unnecessarily serious world, we have these rates of depression and anxiety and all of that going on, and it's like, what do we seem to be missing? Adults seem to really be missing a sense of lightness and fun and just pure enjoyment and, dare we say, whimsy and delight in their lives. And I don't know anybody who is, I know people that are struggling with anxiety or depression, and what don't they have in their life? They don't have a whole lot of laughter. They don't have a whole lot of just, that enjoyment of watching your dog run around a park. They don't have that enjoyment of watching Hugh Lowe stumble around the airport. And these things, while they seem really, they seem really, how would you say? They seem really unimportant. They're actually really important to the human spirit. And I think that's why we reacted so positively towards Playtime. Why I went back and rewatched The Red Balloon and was really looking for. Also, the same with Orpheus, 1950. Again, everyone should watch that film as well. There's a lightness to it. It sort of takes you away from the seriousness of life. And that's really important. You can't be going 100% hardcore, beast mode all the time. That's total bullshit. And everybody needs that careful balance, I think, in their life. And that's what Tati seems to do in this film. and I really want to see his other stuff for sure, man. So I really, really appreciate your bringing him to my attention, because I think, like, in my peripheral vision, maybe I had heard of Playtime or had heard of Tati, but it wasn't something that was jumping out at me to watch. So had it not been for you, I never would have experienced this film.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm glad you're able to
Yeah,
share
this was a good one, man. And no, we definitely should, maybe we should do a double feature at some point with Taxi Driver and La Samurai, two very different films, but both very character analyses. They're character driven pieces. I think that might be our next project together. I'll see if Garrett is down. But those are both really great films that both worth watching again. But again, thank you, man. This has been fun. Thank you all out there for watching. Let us know if there's other films. If you know of other films that maybe match Playtime, or if there's stuff you think we should review, please let us know in the comments below. Please like and share. And yeah, we'll catch you guys next time. So thanks again.